My name is Owen Manahan, and we will be looking at an article titled Health and Suffering from the Islamic Perspective, Islamic Biomedical Ethics. And this will not be a typical review like we've seen in other classes, because this is a different sort of article than what we've been looking at. This is by definition a theological discussion about Islam and about essentially the role of faith and the interpretation of religion and how it plays into the world of health and suffering. The tricky part about this article that I should note before we get into it is that, again, it's a theological discussion, and so it's really a religious evaluation. It's not exactly concluding anything concrete. It's not exactly giving advice. It says that the overall reason for this paper is to provide a general understanding to some of the ethics that might go into healthcare decisions to make more empathetic and culturally competent healthcare professionals throughout the world. So to begin, this article focuses around the main theme of health and suffering and how they're related, and it looks at this in the broader context of death and disease. One of the main questions every religion seeks to answer and understand is suffering, the human condition of suffering, and essentially how it can be equivocated to evilness. And when looking at evilness, there are two ways that it can be broken down into the moral and the physical evil. And there are also psychological and cultural overtones that we'll get a little bit more into that should be looked at as well. And this is important to understand because a lot of the challenges of physical suffering, essentially as the explanation of an evil, are in the realm of healthcare. They loom over healthcare, and when seeking to understand why an individual is suffering, it's these questions of evil that must be answered. Firstly, there is moral evil, which is the intentional ill will perpetuated by a human, free thinking to themselves or others. So this is when you know that you're consciously doing something bad, and some implications of this are that you feel like there's this internal guilt or this internal punishment that you've done something that wasn't good. And oftentimes that feeling is almost like this external feeling, even though it's inside, that many people equate with an external presence like a god or a deity. And next we have physical or natural evil, and this is kind of the opposite of moral evil. It arises from physical, biological, or social causes, and it's not instigated by a human agent. So some classic examples would be an epidemic, a storm, an earthquake. So even though they have to do with humans, it's almost like it's outside of personal control. It's outside of that, and so it goes into this bigger, broader, more external presence context. And thirdly, we also have behaviors that have to do with both physical and natural evil. So for instance, if somebody has a heart attack, yes, they made individual choices like poor diet, poor exercise that are going to contribute to that heart attack, but there's also an external factor as well that's out of their control, because not everybody who eats poorly and has poor exercise has a heart attack. So in my presentation in class, I've provided more context and background to Islam and how it exists today in the world and a brief history, and so try and keep some of those things in mind if you're doing this review. So when looking at Islam, a key component in the realm of health is to look at Sia, and it basically is a word and an idea that conveys the wholeness and integrity of a being that generates a sense of security. So it's connecting life and essentially having moderation in the things you do, moderation to stay healthy, maybe not eating all the way to the point of feeling like you're full, maybe stopping a little bit before. And the primary text, the Quran, prescribes the pursuit of self-knowledge as part of maintaining good health, and physical and psychological health depend on this moderation. So the waters become a bit more murky when we're trying to look at people who suffer from a genetic illness or a child of just 1 or 2 years that is being almost punished that has an illness. And so it brings up the question, and this is not just in Islam, this is in other religions when something like this occurs, is God evil, or does human choice and human behavior factor in? Essentially, it's the question of free will versus determinism, which is an undertone throughout this entire article. And because suffering is so related to theology, if there are different approaches to suffering, which of course has to do in the context of healthcare, if there's different approaches, then there's going to be different problems as well, based off of a patient's individual beliefs. And at its core, religion and medicine have a almost contradictory existence. Religion, at its core, is saying that there's something else that's created me in this world around me, and I am a part of it, and I owe myself to them, and what happens. Whereas medicine, and again, that's just a core summary, whereas medicine more argues for control. It's saying, I can use antibiotics to destroy this disease in myself. I can take control of the natural environment and the surroundings that I've been put in. And so what we see is that medicine has a displacement effect on religion. and that oftentimes people want to overcome suffering because, of course, suffering is uncomfortable, and so medicine is utilized, and that can be difficult to reconcile with religion. And this relationship does inevitably clash in examples like physician-assisted suicide, where religion causes moral belief to believe one thing, and then the more medical, less religious belief will often say the patient has the right to choose to live or die. And this brings up another primary question throughout the article, is that if God controls all things, including destiny, is it anti-religious to interfere with this destiny? And that's really the core issue of the religious argument in physician-assisted suicide. And now transitioning into specifically Islam as an ideology and a theology. When looking at Islam, it's made clear in this article that there's no official position about medical practice. There's no text that says this is exactly what should be done for every single Muslim individual. And this paper doesn't precisely and always distinguish between the different followers of Islam. Of course, just like in other religions, there's different sects. And so it's kind of jumbled together, and it's kind of fluid, transitioning between those groups. And so, for instance, Sunni and Shiite beliefs oftentimes don't align with medical treatment. And so it would be misleading to say that all people follow one unit of thought in Islam. So there's some generalizations that should be taken with a grain of salt. And we can see that Sunnis believe in a human responsibility for suffering, more free will, which we'll get into in a little bit, and Shiites may believe in more of a deterministic view of suffering. And in the discussion of Islam, it should be noted that there is this omnipotence, omniscience, omnipresence of God that saturates all facets of life. And there's a common Islamic term that's said to be with God's permission, and this is a more indicative undercurrent of the entire theology, that it's very in God's hands. In fact, Islam means submission to the will of God, and submission is a very subordinate, non-active role. And so the problems with this expression is that there's extreme predeterminism when it comes to medicine. And so you could have the approach, well, if it's everything happens with God's permission, my sickness is with God's permission, I don't want to seek medicine because I am a strong believer in God. And this brings up the greater question of hope versus despair when considering and following God. And we see this play out as an example in Nigeria amid the inoculation against polio. Some Muslim religious leaders encouraged fellow Muslims to avoid getting inoculated because the idea was that this was a Western front against the will of God. If somebody does have polio, God chose to give that to them, and it's not humans' job to interfere. However, this is, as I've stated, just one Islamic belief. There are also other ideas on this topic. And it brings us to the next question, does God permit natural evil? So that natural evil we talked about is that outside human cause. If God has created everything and has that omnipotence that we talked about, existing everywhere and knowing everything, then what is the point of natural evil? And why would God create that? And so now we get into a bit of a disagreement within the Islamic faith. So even in the Quran, there's different passages that perhaps slightly contradict each other. In this first passage, it imputes evil to human beings, it being God, and the second, it declares good and evil to be from God. So it's this predeterministic, this determinism versus this free will, again, that is a major theme throughout this discussion. And in the free will argument, we see the quote that God wronged them not, but themselves they wronged. So this is saying followers who might be sick have done things in their own life to cause that sickness as a punishment from God. And what that looks like is the evil of suffering. So God causes suffering if you commit the sin of ungrateful disobedience, which at its source is this rejection of the belief in God. So if you are a believer and follow the word of God, then you won't have suffering. And a sin in and of itself is something that's committed against God in the context and the parameters of the described religion. It's not as bad to commit a sin against a fellow human as it is to commit a sin against God, as this reading has explained. And it's difficult. God cannot sin because God is not bound by commandments in the same parameters that a human is. And so God cannot really commit evil because in and of itself, evil is a sin. And so there's this argument that evil in and of itself is not real because the Quran says everything is inherently good, and evil is only really relative, and that which is real must exist outside the mind, and therefore, because it is existing outside the evil is not real. And an act in and of itself is a neutral thing. True classification is only through divine command, which is like the objective nature of good. Real evil must transgress the limits set by God's command, so you have to go outside of that. And again, that's a sin against God. And it's this idea that God does not wrong people, but they wrong themselves and then receive suffering. And suffering is treated as a divinely ordained contingency. And this is a really important point to understand, that it's seen as something passed down for a transgressive sin. And a criticism that's brought up with this is that God's omniscience seems to contradict the omnipotence. It's the idea that if God has foreknowledge, knowing what's going to happen, yet he still wills an affliction to occur despite his ability to prevent it. There's almost an evil that could be attributed to God, depending on your belief system. And the Quran explains how evil is clearly ascribed to human arrogance, disbelief, and disobedience, building on that idea. Human nature itself is perfected through suffering. It's almost like you're off the tracks and suffering is subscribed from divine intervention, and it puts you back on the tracks again, back on the path of not sinning. So we have 4 options that come up when thinking of suffering, evil, and God. And the Quran focuses on the first 3 here, how God prescribes evil. So some suffering is not evil and not from God is the thing outside of religion. So suffering would just exist. That's more of that original medical context we talked about, and that's not as true in Islam. And as mentioned earlier with the vaccine example, the polio eradication, there are believers that believe God will relieve pain and suffering when incomplete, either through cure or through death. And this is difficult to reconcile in some situations, for example, with the suffering of children. In Islam, children are not seen as equivalent, faith-based equivalent of adults, and so this is a moral question that becomes difficult as well. And additionally, animal suffering is difficult as well, because if they're not considered as high and as quality as humans, and the point of having suffering is to keep a human on the divine track, if you will, then why would animals suffer? It's clear animals suffer if you can torture them and you can do horrible things and see that they suffer. And so knowing that, if God has that omnipresence, it's just another question of why would animals suffer? And so in the 9th and 10th centuries in Islam, we see some development in medical thought and in medicine. So the purpose of medicine is to find cures God has created. That's an attitude that begins to become more popular and affirm the quest for medical treatment and the relief of suffering, still within the context and within that proverbial track of acceptance from God. And Muslims follow medical, hygienic, and communal health practices that have religious implications. So it's not just brushing your teeth to be healthy outside of all other things in a vacuum. It has to do with greater religion and the greater wholeness of being. And in the early 18th century, we see some more developments in the form of Mutazilites beginning to form this identity in Islam that humans have free will and free agency. And so it looks at the link between this free will and then divine justice with that health and suffering. The idea is that humans must defend themselves against God's kind punishments. These punishments are meant to be loving, however, they must be interpreted that way. And as one school of thought arises, so does another. And so there's a reaction to this free will theology. And this emphasized the absolute will and power of God and denied the role of nature. And so this is saying God decrees must be known from the source. So there's no interpretation. If there's suffering, there's suffering. It's not humans' job to fix it. And this brings us to the final conclusion that there is an active and there is a passive response in health and suffering in Islam. So there's the school of thought that's more the passive response, and that is that things are determined. It has to do with determinism. God has chosen these things for you to carry out. Perhaps if the child's sick, it's a sin of the parent being carried out on that parent. And then we have the other side, which is active, and this is more free will, saying that what's on earth, God has created, and yes, God has created suffering, and God has created disease, but God has also created cures and solutions to these problems, and it's the job of humans to find these out. And while this paper provides no definitive results or conclusions or statistics, the idea is to generally expand the understanding and empathy of religious individuals, and specifically Muslims following Islam. I hope this was helpful.